Welcome to Under the Microscope. I am your host, Jenny Germano. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I am excited for this next topic. We are going to be discussing cannabis and banking, bridging the gap between operators and institutions. And before I dive in, I'll just share a little bit about my background. I got my start working in the Colorado cannabis industry since 2009 and been working nationally in the industry for the last 10 years. Let's everyone please give a warm welcome to my next guest, Chris Van Dyke. And Chris is partner at Cogent Law. Welcome, Chris.
Jenny, it's so great to be here. A real pleasure and a privilege. I'm so glad that you invited me on your podcast. Heard so much about Under the Microscope and am absolutely delighted to be here. I've been at Cogent now for a couple of years, and my primary responsibilities are to advise banks and credit unions on cannabis banking. There are a lot of risks and compliance hurdles associated with cannabis banking. Prior to my being at Cogent, I was with a financial institution for almost 10 years. We were one of the first in the country to start a cannabis banking program. And we never quite got to the lending side. Our board went back and forth on that. It was just on the deposit side. But the program did develop exponentially. No credit to me. We just happened to be the only game in town. And then prior to working for that FI, I was a state regulator. I was the attorney for the Maine Bureau of Financial Institution. And it was during my last year there, the 2014 FinCEN Guidance, which is like the Bible for banks and credit unions wanting to bank cannabis. That's when that was issued. And we had a lot of questions from our regulated banks and credit unions, even back then, on exactly what that document meant. And so I was helping some of our regulated entities, even back then, as a regulatory attorney. So that's my background in a nutshell. Right now, I do one of four things with the banks and credit unions. I help them get into the space. They're not in the space at all. Usually starting out on the depository side. If they're already in the cannabis space but looking to expand and offer commercial lending, I help them with that on the risk assessments, the special loan covenants that need to be in place for that kind of thing, policies and procedures. And then I've helped a couple that have needed a bit of help because of some regulatory intervention. And then I've also helped a couple make their programs more efficient. So those are the four things I do. I'm also on the spot. If a BSA officer has a particular question about a SAR filing, I pride myself on getting back very quickly to my clients on that kind of thing. So those are the sorts of things that I do.
I love it. Very thrilled to have you here. I think this will be really a window in for people on the cannabis industry side, the operators or anyone working in these cannabis operations, to get this inside look of financial institutions. I'm always trying to bridge the gap between banks and cannabis operators. So they're not always thinking, why are these crazy banks always demanding all these things from us? Why am I not being treated like a normal business? And I know people who are in the banking side of cannabis listen to my podcast. I'm so excited to have you here. It's such a wonderful combination to have you on and to share all your knowledge with us around cannabis banking.
Yeah, Jenny, no, it's great to be here. You and I are two peas in a pod.
Yeah.
Because I work on the compliance on the banking side and you work on the compliance on the operator side.
Yep.
And the similarities between the two industries are actually, there are many.
Banks, they have compliance departments or compliance teams or boards. I've heard all kinds of different names. And cannabis operators, they have compliance teams or compliance officers. And there's regulators on the banking side. And banks get audited. And they get audited and they're under scrutiny. And there's certain guidance that they have to follow and standards, just like on the cannabis side. And it's an interesting sector for people to learn more about it. I wanted to ask before we start diving in, can you explain what CRB means in case anyone listening? I know that acronym's going to get thrown around a lot. And what I've learned a lot from bankers is they love acronyms. At the cannabis industry, they love acronyms too, and state regulators have acronyms. And I try to always define these.
Yeah, really good to do that at the outset before we get too far in. So CRB, yeah, it's a pretty common term, stands for cannabis-related business. And when I use the term, I plant touching firm, one that is actually growing, selling, or distributing a cannabis or a derivative of cannabis. So, and in the banking world, there are also what are known as indirect or ancillary CRBs, and those are service providers that are connected with the direct CRB market. And those represent some elevated risk for banks and credit unions too. So that's the basic jargon. You've got your direct CRBs and your what I call indirect or ancillary CRBs.
That's really helpful. Just an example, I'm an indirect CRB because more than 90% of my clients are plant touching. I work with attorneys and CPAs, but the highest amount I'm working with plant touching
Yeah.
companies. And so I would be considered more of a high risk because my client base is a high risk, if that gives an example.
Yeah. What's very interesting is that there is no definition for what an indirect CRB is. And one can make the argument that Walmart, because it sells Miracle Grow, is an indirect CRB. Now, I disagree with that. But when I was at my FI, I came up with the Van Dyke definition of an indirect CRB, and it passed muster with our regulators. There is some other guidance out there which talks about tier 1, tier 2, and tier
Yes.
3. I'm a big proponent of KISS, keep things simple. And as long as it's reasonable in the eyes of the regulators and you've justified this approach that you're taking in terms of categorization, members or credit union bank customers or credit union members, your examiner should be okay with that.
Yeah. That's really helpful information. Another acronym, KISS. This is great. Keep it simple. That's wonderful.
It's keep it simple, stupid. And that's not a banking, that's a one that my twin brother always uses on
That's so great.
but it's not a banking acronym.
First, I kind of want to start with what do cannabis operators and financial institutions have in common? This is a great place to start.
Yeah, they have so much more in common. There's so many misconceptions between these two industries. And the great irony is that they are probably two of the most highest regulated industries in the country. I came from a state chartered financial institution, so we were regulated by our state examiners, but we were also regulated by our federal examiners because our deposits were insured to our federal regulators. So we had layers of regulation and layers of policies and procedures. And our examiners would come in on a regular basis to make sure that our policies and procedures were up to snuff. And more importantly, that we were following, our practice was consistent with our policies and procedures, and also making sure that we were following federal and state regulations. Jenny, you can probably speak to the compliance burdens on the cannabis side, not the operator side.
They are overwhelmed with compliance burdens. And no matter if they're large MSOs, their compliance burdens, the amount of money they spend is higher. Either way, small or large, they all have compliance burdens. And I think, too, just making sure that they can pass inspections, that they're ready. For example, like with the banks, I don't know if the examiners just pop in or if do they schedule it. And it's different too. In cannabis, some states, they'll let you know they're coming. As the market matures, they stop telling you they're coming and they just show up. Some states out of the gate, they just don't tell you they're coming. Typically, everybody to pass their first inspection to get operational, they know that's going to happen because they have to make sure that they're doing everything that they're supposed to before they make that first sale or plant that first seed. or manufacture that first product. Yeah, there is a burden, the burden of testing and just the cost alone that manufacturers and cultivators have to spend making sure products are in compliance with the testing regulations. And then we have the seed to sale tracking product. We have consumer safety, public safety, all that. It just adds up. And if you ignore it, then you get hit with violations and fines and it becomes more expensive. And not even to mention like OSHA compliance, which a lot of people don't realize that they have to follow OSHA regulations and other federal standards, which now a lot of states are starting to require like QMS or GMP requirements.
Yeah. And on the banking side, the compliance costs, you've got extra employees that you have to hire. When I started at my FI, the BSA department was a department of half a person, which was me.
Oh,
And when I left, our program had grown significantly, but we had a BSA department of 8 people because of the compliance requirements. You've got employee costs. You've also got technology costs. As your program gains traction, it's advisable to use a specialized cannabis compliance banking software. That comes with a cost. These industries, Jenny, you well know, these industries are very cash intensive. So you've also got frontline costs. So you've teller, if you're accepting deposits through your branches, you're going to have extra frontline costs. Many financial institutions invest in what are known as recyclers, which are not cheap, but they will count money extremely quickly and extremely accurately. A lot of financial institutions invest in these recyclers to help count all of the cash that's coming over the counter very quickly. We have an obligation to make sure that money, if it's deposited in a branch, that money shows up in the account the next morning by 9 a.m. There's a regulation in place for that too.
yeah.
So there are numerous compliance costs.
Do you guys have to do SOPs on the banking side?
Absolutely. And I was primarily responsible for drafting those. And there was a number of policies that we had. First and foremost was getting what we had to do delineated in our BSA policy. And then we also had a policy for how to handle the deposits when they came in. So a number of policies, and all of that needs to get the policies of every financial institution need to be board approved, which was actually a good thing because that allowed me the opportunity to attend our board meetings and keep them apprised of our cannabis banking program. And that's another thing that our examiners always looked at was the minutes of the board meetings. And fortunately for us, it showed that the board members were being kept fairly up to speed on our cannabis banking program.
You're under the microscope. We're under the microscope. And which is why I named my podcast, because really we're all under the microscope here in the cannabis industry. And can you remind me what the acronym BSA stands for?
Yeah, again, that slipped and I forgot to define it.
No, it's okay.
No, thank you for doing that. Bank Secrecy Act.
Oh, that's right. Bank Secrecy Act. Okay.
Yeah, and having a bank charter or having a credit union charter, that's a privilege. That allows us to use funds from the Federal Reserve. And because of that, we have obligations to report. And I would say that the core of BSA is one of the cores of BSA is knowing your customer and making suspicious activity reports. They're called SARs, suspicious act. There, I did define that one before.
I know about
Suspicious activity
SARs.
report.
Yeah.
And I mentioned that there's a FinCEN guidance early on that was issued. Basically, it's cautionary but permissive guidance that was issued by the federal government that said, hey, banks, if you elect to bank CRBs, you need to follow this guidance. So anyway, there's additional risk associated. It's not just the compliance costs, but it's also the additional risk associated with cannabis banking that CRBs need to be aware of. And they should be aware of it too, because on your end, on the operator side, there's that risk of the fact that, hey, you might be state legal, but you're still technically federally illegal. You're still operating with a Schedule I substance.
That's true. Thank you for explaining the BSA and SARs. That's really helpful in case somebody listening, they're still learning. I wanted to talk about banking cannabis from a financial institution's perspective. And what are some misconceptions that are out
Yeah,
there?
there are a lot of misconceptions out there. And unfortunately, probably some of your clients have heard them. I've heard that some cannabis operators will go into a bank or credit union and they will be told, no, we can't bank you because you're illegal. And that's glossing things. You're technically a federally illegal substance, but there is this guidance out there issued by the federal government, which is permissive in terms of how you bank cannabis. What the bank should be telling you is that we have elected not to bank cannabis, and that was a risk management decision on our part, that we did not have the risk appetite to bank cannabis. Unfortunately, there's still a relatively small minority of banks and credit unions that are banking cannabis because of the burdens and costs associated with that. But it's different than it was a few years ago.
Oh, it sure is.
There are more banks out there that are willing to bank cannabis. They might not be willing to lend yet the cannabis, but there are more banks that are out there that are willing to take on your deposit account. And that's a good thing for your clientele, Jenny. That's a good thing for the operators because competition is always a good thing. And so hopefully that will have a pricing pressure, hopefully a downward pricing pressure, that fees for the depository accounts because of competition will hopefully reduce.
Honestly, it really has improved for those who are coming in the industry now compared to 2009. As somebody who was running dispensaries, I was dealing with duffel bags of cash. A lot of the operators I was working for, they were depositing cash through ATM machines at 2 a.m. Some really shady stuff was going on. And because I didn't know what else to do, and nobody was really helping anyone in the early days. And if you did have a bank, the fees were outrageous to get banked. And that has changed. We're not walking around with duffel bags of cash anymore. Hopefully nobody's doing that. And we're not depositing cash in ATM machines at 2 a.m. I have noticed the fees have gone down tremendously to get banked as a cannabis operator.
Yeah, and these financial institutions are offering additional services to the cannabis operators like currency transport and smart safes so that they can actually deposit their funds at a safe on their premises, which is linked to the financial institution.
Oh, I love that.
Or,
I love the smart safes.
Yeah, they can see that the money's been deposited into their account, even though they haven't had to go to the bank or credit union to make the physical deposit. So, yeah, banks are they're starting to step up to the plate. And they're also hiring people who understand the cannabis industry too. And I think that's a very important thing in terms of developing trust and affinity with the cannabis customer or member.
Yeah, I agree too. And another thing I've noticed with banks is I'm seeing a lot more education internally about cannabis operators. I've had a couple banks hire me just to educate their team on cannabis operations, and also been hired by banks. And I've also seen banks do this outside of using me, where they're providing educational webinars for their customers relating to their state. Here's a webinar on compliance. Here's some tips. And just providing that educational content also for CRBs. So I see it both ways for the operators and also the additional education for the institutions as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Another misconception that banks used to have, I don't think they have it so much now, but they thought that there was a significant reputational risk associated with the cannabis banking. And they just said, no, we don't want that type of customer in our bank or credit union. And I think it was 𝗘𝗽𝗶𝘀cie from Shield Compliance who put it best. He said, the days of the stoner owner are gone.
Yes.
And the fact of the matter is that these folks, these operators are sophisticated folks.
Yep.
And they have to be. They have to have some level of sophistication in order to operate in these high intensively compliant environments. And they also understand the fact that banks and credit unions have these compliance burdens because they have them as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great quote from Tony. It's true. Cannabis operators are very sophisticated and intelligent and business-minded people. I think we're finally getting away from the stigma, although it still exists, and it's probably going to take a decade. I always try to remind people, remember the days where we allowed people to smoke cigarettes everywhere? Everywhere. I'm from the 80s. You would smoke on planes and restaurants and bars and malls and movie theaters everywhere. But now that's no longer the case. And I look at cannabis as the same way. It's going to take a while to shift the perspective of the whole entire country because we're at different phases across the country. Some states, maybe banking, it might be a little more challenging versus states that are saturated with cannabis operators. Or maybe there's more credit unions coming online going, oh, we had somebody walk into our bank that needs an account and that state's getting ready to launch cannabis licensing. And maybe they're reaching out to you. Hey, how do we do this? We need help. How do we set up our CRB program? And so the United States is on a spectrum, really, on where everyone's at, what stage the market, whether mature or they're an emerging market. So it's just going to take time. It's going to take the whole entire U.S. market having legal cannabis and everyone getting caught up and all the markets getting caught up before it's like an even playing field.
Yeah, and I do think we'll get there eventually. Good things come to those who wait. My mother always used to tell me that. And it's true. It is going to take a long time, unfortunately. But we have had movement lately with this executive order. I haven't received anything on my eyewash lately about what's happening with that, but we do have President Trump, who signed the executive order on December the 18th, directing the Attorney General and federal regulatory agencies to reschedule cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. And oh, by the way, Tylenol coated with codeine is a Schedule 3 drug. That's a far cry from LSD and the other Schedule 1 drugs that are out there. One of the other misconceptions I think that banks have is that, and credit unions, is that we're going to lose our non-cannabis customers or members because of our cannabis program.
Mm-hmm.
And again, and I speak from personal experience here, we had a pretty conservative customer base at my financial institution. Was not the case at all. We didn't lose one customer.
Wow.
As a result of our cannabis banking program. And I think the perception was that, oh, here's a financial institution that can handle that risk and is willing to take on that risk. I look at the risks associated with cannabis banking in kind of three circles.
Yeah.
And by far and away, the biggest circle of risk in the middle is the BSA compliance risk and getting a downgrade in your compliance program. You get these report cards from your examiners. They come in on a regular basis, 18 months, and they issue a very, very detailed examination report and it's great. You get grades on them. And you can get graded on your compliance program, which is part of your overall management. And that by far and away is, I think, the biggest circle of risk. And again, this is my view, that I think that there are two other significantly smaller circles of risk associated with cannabis banking. And one of them is what we've just been talking about, the reputational risk. And I think each and every day that reputational risk gets smaller and smaller because the stigma attached to cannabis is going away and will continue to go away. The trajectory on that is very clear. The stigma is going away. There is also and this sounds odd coming from an attorney, but I think there's also a small legal circle of risk.
Yeah.
There are arguments on the books that even in spite of this FinCEN guidance, this permissive guidance, there's arguments on the books that banks and credit unions are aiding and abetting or committing RICO. But again, I view that as a very small circle of risk, and history is on my side. There has not been one financial institution that's been prosecuted for banking cannabis. There's one financial institution that received who consented to a cease and desist order
Okay.
because they had a deficient program.
Mm.
That was it. So those are what I view as the three circle of risk. There are other risks too, operational risks that we've talked about and so forth. But I view those three risks as being the primary three risks.
So essentially, banks have to have risk management processes, and just in cannabis, there's risk management. In insurance, there's risk management. When managing employees, there's risk management because you have worker safety. You're held to the same standard with risk management.
Yeah, it's all about risk management. And I mentioned that that 2014 FinCEN Guidance a couple of times now, and it's a pretty thin document. It's not like a regulation. There are no definitions or there's no official staff commentary kind of explaining provisions in it. And what the FinCEN Guidance meant back in 2014 and what it means now from an examiner's perspective are two very different things. And with the good examiners, when they come in, what they are going to be asking themselves is this financial institution managing the risk appropriately?
Yeah.
That's really what it boils down to. And that's why for every decision that a financial institution makes regarding its cannabis program, it needs to be backed up by a reason.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really helpful. And I also want to tackle for banks, what are the benefits of banking CRBs? Because there's probably banks out there that still are not banking CRBs, or they haven't had anyone walk in yet, because maybe we still have states, they do not have medical cannabis or adult use, which is even less. And they might have states that have hemp, but hemp is completely different. And the risk associated with hemp is not as high because of the farm bill. But as we know, that's the future of that is up in the air with the potential ban that could take place in November. We could have a whole other episode on that. But right now, hemp companies are not considered that risk, but that could change here in the future. They could be put in the same category, the cannabis side.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about hemp in a moment. And I'm really glad you brought that up, Jenny. But what are the benefits to a financial institution for banking CRBs? And banks don't operate out of altruism. They're looking at the bottom line and getting into the program, and they charge based on two things, risk and time. And there's a significant amount of risk and time involved in having a CRB banking program. But because of that, there's justification for having fee income derived from your depository accounts. And that can be anything as simple as a flat monthly fee. The other thing they will find is that as long as your program is sustainable and you don't end up being their last boyfriend or girlfriend, you can have tremendous affinity with your customer base. You're also diversifying your portfolio by having the cannabis. Diversification is always a good thing. People always talk about diversification on the investment side, but diversification on the banking side is very important too, to mitigate risk. And the other important consideration is, I'll state this in negative terms, but the lost opportunity cost. If banks and credit unions aren't getting into this space now or aren't considering the space now, they may be too late into the game. Because it's still a pretty small minority of banks and credit unions that are banking cannabis. So there is still room for banks and credit unions to get into this space, but that will not last forever. So that's important to realize.
Let's talk about the hemp piece, because I don't want to leave that one off the table, because I'm actually excited to hear your feedback on this.
Yeah, no, thanks so much. My own view, and I have a few clients who have hemp customers, and I applaud them for that. But in my own view right now, with all of the uncertainty that's going on with the hemp industry. And I'll just give you a little bit of background on that. So we had in the Farm Bill that was passed in 2018, there was a loophole, which meant that infused hemp product industries that did not use a certain type of THC, delta 9, they basically were operating in an unregulated market. And there were also, the FinCEN guidance didn't apply to them because they were hemp, not cannabis. And so a lot of banks were not going to bank cannabis, but we'll bank hemp because they are lower risk.
Yeah.
And then what happened in November last year on the Farm Appropriations Bill, Senator Mitch McConnell, he basically threw in a provision at the 11th hour, which would criminalize the infused hemp product industry effective November 2026. And so that not only threw the hemp industry into a tizzy, but it also threw the banks and credit unions who are hemp into a tizzy too. What are we going to do? But there are fixes underway in Congress right now to get that fixed. And the one that I think is gaining traction the most is a bill that will delay the effective date of that recriminalization for, I think, November 2000 for 2 years.
Yeah.
And so that will give Congress enough time to do a real permanent fix. So I'm advising certain financial institutions on their hemp accounts in order to mitigate those risks with hemp too.
Hopefully that does get put in place. I don't want to see hemp companies go out of business. I really would like to see this treated as one plant that has many uses, and let's regulate the uses of that plant and stop dividing the industry and find ways that we work together and not trying to separate us. And cannabis can't play in that sandbox and hemp can't play in this sandbox. And hopefully we can get eventually where we're all playing in the same sandbox one day.
I completely agree with you. Both hemp and cannabis, they need to be regulated. And they're for obvious reasons. Unfortunately, the way government works and particularly the way the federal regulatory agencies work, it's going to be a long time out for that.
Yeah.
Now,
I'm keeping my fingers crossed, hopefully for a good future for all of us in the industry, including hemp. Another piece I want to tackle, this might be helpful for cannabis businesses. What are questions for them to ask when they're looking for a financial institution to bank with? When I work with brand new people in the industry, oftentimes I say you need to go in with a list of questions for that POS system or your software. What are some good questions they could be thinking about with their banks or these institutions?
yeah, so obviously you're going to want to find out what the fees are and whether in line with what other FIs are charging. But I think one of the most important questions is how long have they had a CRB program? And in particular, have they been through an exam yet? Have they been through a regulatory exam where the examiners have looked at the CRB program? And so that would be one of my first questions. I would also ask, what kind of basic knowledge do they know about CRBs? Because I think that's really helpful too, particularly if they're looking for a commercial loan either now or down the road. I think having folks understand the industry, and there are some banks and credit unions out there that are hiring people who have been in the cannabis industry to work with their compliance departments. And I think that's a really smart, good move on the part of banks and credit unions. Very obvious question is, what are your compliance expectations of me? What am I going to have to do in order to maintain this account? And if that bank or credit union says, oh, not very much, you should start looking for another bank or credit union.
Yeah.
Because the reality is that, you're not going to want them to be your last boyfriend or girlfriend. It is a fairly intrusive relationship, both with the onboarding of the client. As I mentioned before, BSA is all about knowing your client, knowing your customer. And with respect to CRBs, It's knowing your customer on steroids. You really have to dig deep and know a lot about the CRB and also making sure that it's licensed and in good standing with the cannabis regulators and that there's no significant negative news associated with the cannabis with that operator. The other things I mentioned, lending, more and more financial institutions are looking at offering commercial lending. If a bank or credit union is doing cannabis depository services already, they've already crossed a very significant hurdle in terms of their compliance expectations, which is a great thing. But I do think, and Jenny, you know this probably better than anyone,
Yeah.
there's underwriting risk associated
Yes.
with this industry because of the consolidation that's going on. A lot of the smaller operators, because of the compliance burdens, because of the 280E tax burden, they're having a hard time staying afloat. My take on commercial lending is that real risk there, if you're already satisfying the compliance requirements on the depository side, the real risk is the underwriting because of what's going on with the industry.
Those are really helpful, really good questions for operators to be thinking about. I don't think they really have thought about those things. They might ask about fees, like more common things, but I don't think they go into a bank and say, "How experienced are you in the cannabis industry? How long have you had your program for?" So those are really good items to highlight for operators. That's going to be very helpful for people listening. You brought up onboarding. I want to talk about the process for cannabis
Sure.
businesses because I'm sure they're just like, what the heck is going on? When I just went and opened my personal account, I didn't have to go through all these different
Right.
things. So
Right.
if you could talk a little bit about the onboarding piece.
Yeah. Each bank or credit union, they will have their own, there's not a kind of a standard list of questions, but it'll be an in-depth list of questions. They will need to be answered in some detail by the CRB. And behind the scenes, the bank and credit union, they're going to be doing their own due diligence through various forms of software to see, again, whether or not there's any negative news associated with it, there's any litigation going on. They want to look at your financials to see how your financials are doing, how they're trending. And there's also going to there's going to be an expectation on the part of the financial institution that a majority of the revenues derived from the CRB are actually going to be deposited into the bank account. It takes at least a few weeks. On average, I would say it takes a few weeks to go from initial call to say, hey, I want to open an account to having the account opened, funded, and operational.
And are there capital considerations? Because I'm thinking about a lot of the capital issues in the cannabis industry. And a lot of times, especially if they're a micro business or social equity license holder or just a small mom and pop with a standard license. And a lot of times they're raising capital and a lot of that money's going to the build out and to the construction. I work with clients who don't even have their cannabis banking set up yet. They're not operational and they quite haven't made the jump, but they're still raising capital. And are those considerations thought of if the money activity looks a little crazy in the beginning when they're just a startup?
So it'll depend on the financial institution. Credit unions generally, they tend to be more willing to work with smaller operators. And in terms of capital requirements, generally, if you're a financial institution that's just working on the depository side, it doesn't matter as nearly as much. But certainly on the commercial lending side, it's like any other industry. A bank or credit union generally is not going to offer a significant commercial loan to any business that's just starting out, whether it be
Yeah.
cannabis or non-cannabis. It's again, it really gets back to underwriting and the enhanced underwriting risks that I talked about associated with because of what's going on with the cannabis industry. The risks are certainly greater. Not so much on the compliance side, but I would say on the underwriting side in terms of getting financing. Some of the larger financial institutions, they're only willing to work with the larger MSOs, larger adult use players, because they're going to be getting more significant deposits, and that helps the capital ratios for the bank. But credit unions, for the most part, this is a generalization, but I would say that credit unions, for the most part, are more, if they're in the cannabis space, they're a little bit more receptive to opening depository accounts for both small and large CRBs.
I would think MSOs would be such a big risk. I feel like there's such a big risk compared to a small operator. I work with a lot of small operators. They pay their bills on time. They don't have large amounts of investments or capital that they have to raise compared to an MSO. And I also see the MSOs that are going bankrupt. Even in Colorado, it's happening. A lot of these companies are going bankrupt. Some people are getting sued. They owe $300,000 to $400,000 to just one operator for product. And so to me, that's a big risk for a bank.
There are different risks depending on what type of CRB you are. And I'm overgeneralizing here, so apologies in advance. I think with the larger MSOs, you'll have folks, a CFO, for instance, on staff, and a certain degree of greater sophistication, I think, on the financial side. So there's less risk there. But you're absolutely right. There's a lot of risk associated with the MSOs, but different types of risks, I would say, associated with the smaller operators.
It's true if we talk about cannabis operational compliance. MSOs, their risk is different than just a standalone dispensary. That standalone dispensary, they still have to follow the same compliance, the same regulations. But when we get to the MSO, I find that their problems are a lot different, where their issues are tied to being in multiple states, struggling to streamline compliance throughout the entire company across 10 states. And so I feel like their risks are a lot different, where if I was just a dispensary, I have a manager who's going to be handling the compliance, and I'm not trying to have compliance with packaging and labeling across 10 states, or maybe I'm on 3 different inventory management platforms. Some states have metrics, some have their own inventory seed-to-sale tracking system, and that can be a challenge. So they have their own kind of bag of challenge, or their circle of risk. I love what you were talking about earlier, the circle of risk. That's a great visual and how to see risk. I wanted to also ask, how can cannabis businesses be good financial institution customers to banks? Are there any things that they could work on just as far as being a good customer?
Yeah, I think it all boils down to one word, and that is transparency.
Yeah.
And being cooperative, being timely, accepting the fact that this is going to be an intrusive relationship, and that it really works to their advantage if they respond in a very timely way to the questions that the financial institution is asking, any unusual questions about the account activity, why was there this unusual transaction, and even being proactive and giving compliance departments reasons in advance about, hey, there's going to be some changes in my account activity, and this is why. Transparency and being transparent and being timely in terms of getting the information that the bank or credit union is asking for. Those two things, I think, are the most important.
That's really helpful. And operators know how to do that, because if we flipped what you just said and applied it to the cannabis regulators, we have to do the same thing on the operation side. We have to be transparent. If a regulator comes in and asks you for something and you're supposed to get it to them within 24 hours, and then you don't, and a month goes by, you're putting yourself at risk. If you were going to travel overseas, you have to tell your bank, by the way, I'm going to use my debit card in Europe. And there's certain things that you can set forth if you're traveling overseas with your bank account. And I've learned that when I went to Mexico, and I didn't tell my bank I was going to Mexico, and they shut down my debit card. And I learned the hard way, and I didn't have access to my money while I was in Mexico.
A good example. Yeah, just giving them a heads up.
Yeah, so just communicating with your bank, just like you would the regulators. You want to do the same thing and be transparent. Cannabis regulators, they're not walking around saying, gosh, I just can't wait to bust all these people and get one over on them and mess with them and harass them. And although some people would like to think that's what they're doing, if you're transparent and honest, I think that's really all they want from you, the regulators. Don't try to deceive us. I feel sometimes people get nervous and they make things up and they think they have to lie and hide and be secretive when all you had to do is be honest. What I've learned in the cannabis industry and running these operations, if you're doing the best that you can and you have all the SOPs in place and you're training and you're taking compliance seriously, sometimes mistakes do happen, but they're not going to rake you over the coals if they see how much that you really are putting in effort and you're communicating and you're being transparent. But if you try to fly under the radar and hide and won't open your door when they knock on the door, I've known people who literally will not answer the door if they see the regulator on camera. They won't let them in. Obviously, dispensaries they can walk right into, but I've known grows and manufacturers are like, oh, that's the regulator. We're not going to open the door.
Yeah, that's not going to get you very far.
No.
You can have a very short lifespan as an operator if you continue that kind of behavior. And it's the same on the banking side. The regulators aren't looking for perfection. I have this saying, I don't know where I came up with this, but perfection is the enemy of good.
Yeah.
If you only accept perfection, that kind of makes you dysfunctional. But again, on the banking side, if the regulators see that you have a robust program in place, policies and procedures are good, you're following them, your board is kept fully aware. The regulators are reasonable people.
Yeah.
They get short shrift sometime and they look at the big picture.
They do.
And they're going to come away with some recommendations and some findings. And if they don't, their superintendent is going to say, what have you been doing all this time? You have to accept the fact that there are going to be some recommendations and they're there to make you a stronger financial institution.
Really helpful. I have another question. So where do operators unintentionally create risk for themselves?
On the banking side,
Yeah.
I would say it goes back to what we were just talking about, not responding fully and in a timely way to questions that banks compliance department are asking. I would say that's the risk there. There are other really obvious risks like losing your license and things like that. But from the banking, in terms of jeopardizing the banking relationship, I would say that's the biggest risk. And also, the banks have discretion about this kind of thing too. And well, again, former existence, some of our CRBs, they got stroppy when we were asking them all these questions. They, of all people, should know that we're not doing this because we want to do it. We're doing this because our regulators are requiring it. CRBs should recognize that.
And also, to follow the rules that your bank sets forth. I'm sure when they onboard you, they're going to go over all the things, what to do, what not to do. For example, your money only gets picked up by an armored truck. Don't walk into the bank with a duffel bag thinking you're going to deposit a bunch of cash because they're not going to take it. There's processes every bank has. So if your money's getting picked up and getting delivered to the Federal Reserve, follow that process.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And one I neglected to mention too, apart from the compliance expectation, there are going to be operational expectations like following the cash deposit procedures that bank or credit union has in place. Really good point.
We don't need bankers getting mad at us at all. And wrapping up, if you could give any other tips that you want to leave cannabis operators with, and even banks too, if you want to do one for each one, that's fine as well.
Yeah, I think it's really just points that we touched on already. I think cannabis operators, if you have a banking relationship already, it might be a good idea, and you've got a good relationship with your financial institution, there may be opportunity to negotiate your fee. That's something you might want to talk to them. If you're looking for a commercial loan, you might want to raise that politely with your financial institution to see if because these operators are still desperate for financing. Banks are the obvious trusted financial partner, and you're not going to be charged an extortionate rate.
Yeah.
And sometimes the answer isn't no, but not now. It's maybe check back in a year or two. And I've always been an advocate of carrots for compliance. In other words, if you're a good compliant CRB with your FI, you're giving them all this information, and you've got good, strong financials, then even if the answer is initially no to a loan, I think you down the road, I think you may stand a better chance of getting some financing. For financial institutions, I think the financial institutions that are not in the market now, I don't think they're fully weighing the potential lost opportunity cost of cannabis banking. As I said before, the trajectory is pretty clear. I know there have been some state initiatives to make adult use cannabis illegal. In Maine, anyway, that's failed. There was a citizens initiative that failed up here. But the trajectory is pretty clear with this executive order. And the benefit is going to go to the early movers in this space.
Yeah, that's helpful. And carrots for compliance. I'm stealing that. That's good.
Yeah, that's one for you, Jenny.
I'm like, oh, that's golden. I love that. No, thank you.
That's one I came up with myself.
No, I love it. I always love good, catchy phrases. Thank you so much for coming on. This was really helpful. I think you shared a lot of good information, and I think it's really going to help listeners who are interested in learning more about banking institutions and just good ideas and tips on what questions they can ask when they're opening up an account. So I really appreciate you coming on and sharing all your wonderful knowledge.
Jenny, it's been just a real delight talking to you, and I can't wait to see you again at the next conference.
Yes, I will be in New Mexico for the Banking Experience Conference, and I think it's in Albuquerque coming up in July, right? July 15th.
15th, yeah, just north of Albuquerque.
Yeah, so I'm excited. That is such a fun conference. And for anyone who likes to listen to the podcast, we are available on streaming on Spotify and Apple or wherever you like to listen. And also, please go check out my YouTube channel, which is at Under the Microscope with Jenny. And please subscribe and follow me on there. I will have Chris's information and Cogent Law. I'll have their link to their website in the description box.
Jenny, thank you so much. And my details, my cell number, I do pride myself on being available. And my cell phone number is 207-844-0196. And my email address is cvandyke, that's CVANDYCK, @cogentlaw.com.
Perfect. And how many attorneys do you know that will ever do that? So, you are special there, Chris. Definitely feel free to reach out to Chris if you have any questions, whether you're an operator or a banking institution. Thanks for being here. And thank you to our listeners. And I will see you guys all next week on the podcast.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you.